thank you, Hugh, for that very kind introduction. Well, my first pleasant duty in giving these two Douglas Southall Freeman public lectures is to thank the History Department of the University of Richmond for the honour it's done me in inviting me to spend this spring semester as visiting professor in this famous city and on this lovely campus. I don't claim to fathom the arcane procedures by which this came about, but the first time Christine and I spent in the USA, 40 years ago now, was at a university in the south, although further south than this. We had an excellent time there, and it's a real and unexpected pleasure to be invited back to the south after so long. Secondly, it would be remiss of me not to pay tribute to the memory of Douglas Southall Freeman himself. Thanks to David Johnson's excellent biography, I've enjoyed capturing the flavour and the character of this remarkable man, even as I've been daunted by the prospect of his enormous physical and intellectual energy and the major contributions that he made to the history of Virginia and of America in general, both in writing about it and playing his own part as a journalist in momentous times. Sir Lewis Namier, perhaps the most influential historian in the 20th century of 18th century England, used to say that a great historian is one after whose work nobody ever again will be able to write in the terms of the preceding era. Well, by those standards, it seems to me Douglas Southall Freeman's biographies of Robert E. Lee and George Washington made him indisputably a great historian, and one who most of us who spend time in Richmond in his name can only dream of living up to. Now, looking through the long list of Freeman's works, I came across an early result of his researches on the life of Robert E. Lee, published in the somewhat unlikely place of Scribner's Magazine for 1925. It was called Lee and the Ladies. Seems, therefore, not altogether inappropriate if I devote my lecture tonight to another great general and the ladies, although one, it must be said, a good deal less polite and chivalrous than Robert E. Lee. Now, everybody knows something about Napoleon. Everybody has a vague idea of who he was and what he did, and of course what he looked like. He's one of that handful of figures in history who's universally known by his first name only. And perhaps the only one whose portrait everybody instantly recognizes, especially if he's wearing his hat. And in the popular mind, Napoleon, I suggest, is remembered, or at least he's known, probably for two things besides his appearance. One, of course, his reputation as one of the greatest generals of all time, his prowess on the battlefield. Nobody can seriously dispute that. The other is his prowess in the boudoir. Rightly or wrongly, we all seem to have got the idea that Napoleon was a man of great sexual power, attraction, appetite. And my starting point is to discuss, so it's the starting point, but the starting point is to discuss how true a picture this was. Now, the first problem is to disentangle the man from the ruler, if indeed that's really possible. After all, Napoleon was a ruler for half of his adult life. He was the commander of victorious armies for 4 years in addition to that. As Henry Kissinger once said, power is a great aphrodisiac, and during his years of power, Napoleon was able to call upon almost any woman he wanted, and there was never any shortage of women prepared to make themselves available to him. The only evidence we have of Napoleon's relationship with women before he became a great man, and didn't have the freedom that gave him, is the case. I've distributed this list of names, some of which are rather difficult, so I hope that will help. This is the case of Désirée Clary. who some of you will perhaps remember made the subject of a Hollywood epic called Desiree, with Marlon Brando playing the young artillery lieutenant and the late Jean Simmons as the eponymous heroine. Now, Napoleon said that Desiree was the first woman to attract him. He met her in Marseille in 1793 when he and his whole family had been driven out of Corsica by Corsican separatists. He made her the heroine of the novel that he wrote about that time, Clisson et Eugénie. His brother, Joseph, married her sister, Julie, so she remained part of the family. She did, in fact, become a queen, but not Napoleon's queen. In 1798, she married General Bernadotte, whom Napoleon made a marshal, and who, in 1818, became King of Sweden. She seems to have been genuinely attracted to Napoleon, but she saw nothing much of him after 1793, and in 1796, he finally gave her the brush off. By then, he'd met Josephine. Now, Desiree seems to have loved him far more than he ever loved her. And that's because from only a few months after they met, he actually was much more in love with something else. He's much more in love with his own power, with his own glory, and the big-time life that it gave him. At one level, you could almost say that the only person Napoleon was ever in love with was himself. He was indeed the complete narcissist. The man who said at one point, "What are a million lives to a man like me?" Well, such thoughts were far ahead of him in 1794, 1795, but even then, you can see that single-minded drive to distinguish himself, seize every opportunity, not get caught in dead-end jobs. And you can bet that during all this time, he didn't give Desiree a thought. And by the time he reached national prominence in the early autumn, as we say on my side of the Atlantic, of 1795, he already had no more need to spend time, you might almost himself say waste time, if you like, looking around for emotional attachments, because women came looking for him. He's a rising young man, he's got plenty of prospects, and that's where Josephine came in. She was a penniless widow with 2 children to support and expensive tastes. She was, by all accounts, very sexy, and she lived from day to day by offering herself to the rich and the powerful. She's what we would call a gold digger. But she's already getting on. She's 33 by this time, and some said her looks, especially her teeth, were fading away. Bonaparte might be the last best chance that she had, and he was the man of the moment, so she encouraged him as she'd encouraged other people before him, only to find that this time she got more than she bargained for, because he felt passionately, violently in love with her, and insisted they got married. An inexperienced but passionate young man, seduced by a very experienced older woman, who in turn found his attentions quickly overwhelming. Well, luckily for her, she got rid of him only a few weeks after their marriage, in March 1796, when he went off to command the army in Italy and made his name as a general in the field. Well, who knows if that would have been the end of Napoleon's sex life, or at least his sexual adventures, but for 2 things. One is Josephine's infidelity. Hardly had he disappeared over the Alps than she was doing the rounds of other lovers, while at the same time luxuriating in the glory of being the wife of the hero of Italy. He kept urging her to come and join him in a passionate series of letters, but she put it off as long as she could, and when she did eventually go, she had a young lover in tow. Napoleon appears not to have noticed. And it's only when Josephine failed to join him on his expedition to Egypt in 1798, for the perfectly good reason that he couldn't know she had actually been injured in a building collapse, But it's only then that one of his aides decided that really there was enough evidence now to tell him what everybody else knew already. And the effect was electric. Napoleon vowed to divorce her as soon as he got back to France. Meanwhile, he took his revenge by publicly taking a mistress, the wife of one of his junior officers, Pauline Forest. Apparently, he told her that if she gave him a son, he would divorce Josephine and marry her. And that's the second thing that kept Napoleon's sex life going. He wanted a son. He'd already made this clear to Josephine. The place where she was injured in 1798, in fact, was a spa where the waters were supposed to promote conception. That's why she was there. But by now, she would soon be too old to have children. And then what? On Napoleon's side, there's the creeping fear that he might be infertile. And for a red-blooded Corsican, married now for 4 years, that's humiliating enough. And it's perhaps significant that when Pauline Forest failed to become pregnant, he dumped her. And meanwhile, it's a humiliation that he seemed prepared to live with. And when he returned from Egypt in 1799, it was to take power back in France. As head of state, he felt more dignified with a consort. And it's probably that which saved Josephine from divorce when he did get back. At least that, and the realization by Josephine herself that she really could not any longer sail that close to the wind. Caesar's wife must be above suspicion, and she dumped her lover. The passion between her and Napoleon was gone. But they now rubbed along, and she did a decent public job, which she seems to have appreciated. But when, in 1804, they became an emperor and an empress, then the problem resurfaced a lot more urgently. Monarchs need heirs of their body to perpetuate their line. Preferably, they need sons, especially in France, where the Salic law of succession had always governed monarchical tradition, and no woman had ever reigned. By this time, Napoleon had got into the habit of sleeping with whoever he fancied. Josephine, too, seems to have believed that he was infertile. She raised no trouble about it, and quick liaisons became Napoleon's style. You know, wait next door, get undressed, I'll be along when I've got a spare moment. And when he found time, it often was only for a moment, and then it's back to work. And there are stories of girls waiting in the freezing cold for hours and then being told to go away because the great man was too busy. But in 1806, one of these swift liaisons had a very unexpected result. Eleanor de Noël, employed to read to Josephine, was bedded by Napoleon almost as soon as he saw her. And 9 months later, she had a son. He was called, half after his father, Léon. Apparently he looked like Napoleon. He liked to see him from time to time. Napoleon left him substantial sums in his will. The idea even seems to have crossed his mind to legitimize him and make him his heir. But I don't think that was ever terribly serious. The importance of Léon was that he showed Napoleon that he could have children, and boys as well, at that. And from then on, the writings on the wall for Josephine. In the nicest possible way, of course, Napoleon by now seems to have been genuinely fond of her, I think. Witness his decision to crown her, as well as himself, at the imperial coronation, in the teeth of opposition from his entire family. But as time went by, he worried more and more about that absence of direct heirs. And then, in 1807, when Josephine was far away, he fell in love for the second time in his life. This time it's Marie Walewska, a Polish countess whom he met while he's campaigning in the east against the Russians. another film attached to this. Some people may have seen it. Charles Boyer playing Napoleon, and Greta Garbo as Marie Walewska. The film is called Conquest. Well, Napoleon was smitten by her. And as soon as they saw this, the Polish nobles of the circles that she moved in pressed her to offer herself to him. They saw Napoleon as the liberator of their country, a country which was wiped off the map in 1795 by three Eastern powers, three powers whom Napoleon had defeated, or in the case of Russia, used. Well, she was reluctant, but that made Napoleon all the more ardent. But eventually, well, relatively eventually, it was really only a matter of a few weeks, but eventually she succumbed. Napoleon, for his part, did not find himself thinking of her as just another passing fancy. He kept on seeing her, and eventually, in May 1810, she gave him another son, Alexander, whom it suited everybody to treat as the legitimate child of a very elderly husband. Napoleon saw them both regularly until the eve of his downfall. They visited him on Elba, and again before he left Paris after Waterloo to give himself up to the British. Like Léon, he was remembered in Napoleon's will. But the importance of Alexander Walewski is greater than this. What his birth confirmed, even more than that of Léon, was that Napoleon could have sons. Since shortly after meeting Marie, in fact, having defeated every continental enemy, Napoleon had been thinking quite seriously about divorcing Josephine. But not to marry his new love, for all their passion. What he wanted was royal links. I must be connected with princes, he said. In other words, it's not just heirs he wants authentic royal heirs. And he considered a number of possibilities, but when he defeated the Austrians in a renewed bout of warfare in 1809, the best of all possible solutions, hitherto not available, presented itself. Like so many French rulers before him, he could marry a member of the oldest and the most illustrious ruling house in Europe, the Habsburgs. They got little choice, and defeated as they were, they could see advantages in admitting the Corsican upstart into their family. And so, in 1810, it finally happened. And if we discount, say, Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, the most famous divorce in history took place. Josephine was dumped. Napoleon married the Archduchess Marie-Louise. Jumped into bed with her the first night he saw her. He was delighted by the way she responded. He was even more delighted when, just over a year later, a legitimate son was born, the King of Rome. Well, the tragic story of the King of Rome, L'Aiglon, the eaglet, is very well known. After his father's downfall, he grew up to an empty life in Vienna, died there in 1832, remembered in France, at least between 1852 and 1870, as Napoleon II, but never ruling anywhere, showing no obvious affinities with his father's character. But meanwhile, his birth marked the end of Napoleon's sexual adventures, or at least any very significant ones. Well, that's the personal record. But Napoleon's attitude to women is not just a personal matter. Napoleon ruled France for 15 years, and intermittently much of Europe during that time. So what he felt about women and how he saw their role is a matter of great importance to half the population, at least. And predictably, he got very strong views on the matter. And these views were strictly functionalist. The role of women was to be wives and mothers. Above all, mothers. He once described women as machines for making babies. Another occasion, fruit trees to be harvested. At his crudest, he saw them as mere studs for soldiers. Another of his famous one-liners was that the loss of a particularly bloody battle could be made up by one night in Paris. But of course, the role of women didn't end with reproduction. Their function was also to educate and bring up children according to correct principles and with the right views, the right attitudes. And that's a very heavy responsibility, but one he knew that women could undertake, because that's what they were made for. And how did Napoleon know that? Because he had before him the example of his own mother, the formidable Laetitia, promoted after he became emperor to the unprecedented title of Madame Mère, Madame Mother, the woman who had given the world the wonder child himself. She seems to have been the only human being whom Napoleon was ever in awe of. She did, after all, have quite an impressive track record. She was widowed at 35, bringing up 8 unruly children, having born 4 more who died. She brought them up very strictly, very religiously, while running a frugal, solvent household after her husband died. So, of all the women in Napoleon's life, she was perhaps the most important of all. She's an enduring example in his mind of what a woman ought to be. She was unintellectual. And intellectualism was what Napoleon hated most in women. I want, he said, in describing his ideal education for girls, I want not women of charm, but women of virtue. They must be attractive because they have high principles, warm hearts, not because they're witty or amusing. And above all, he hated what he called meddlesome women. Women who interfered in men's affairs, which meant the business of the world. And one woman in particular epitomized everything that he hated, Madame de Staël. Madame de Staël was the daughter of Necker. Necker, Louis XVI's notorious Swiss finance minister who run up the debts, which finally brought down the old monarchy. She grew up attending her mother's salon in Paris, the last of the great gatherings of influential hostesses that had played such a part in the propagation of the Enlightenment. That background left her feeling entitled to exercise influence in public affairs. She thought she was important and deserved to be taken seriously. When Napoleon returned to Paris as the conqueror of Italy in 1797, she made a dead set at him, perhaps even hoped to seduce him. But he was simply embarrassed, and that rapidly led to annoyance. And when, after he took over power, her salon and her writings became a centre of opposition to his rule, his first impressions were confirmed. In 1802, she was banished from Paris, and everything she wrote after that was banned wherever Napoleon's writ ran. He considered her both silly and dangerous, and he'd fly into rages whenever her name was even mentioned. She was indeed one of the main fermenters of opposition to Napoleonic rule, although that opposition is never more than intellectual and critical. But as such, she's a constant irritant to a man who couldn't stand criticism, and a constant reminder of how appalling women could be if they once tried to go beyond the role that nature had assigned them. Now, all this suggests to me that in reality, behind the appearances, Napoleon is rather afraid of women, or at least ones he couldn't control. That's the secret of his mother's power, of course. It's the secret of Staël's power. Maybe even Josephine's power as well, before he became the ruler of France and not simply her husband for the time being. He couldn't fully control any of them. And he had before him as well the example of what the ordinary women of Paris had done during the Revolution, dragging the royal family back to Paris in October 1789, pushing their menfolk to violent extremes in 1792, when Napoleon had actually been there himself to watch the massacres and the mutilations visited upon the dead bodies of men by women when the monarchy was overthrown. They were a force pushing both revolution and counter-revolution in violent directions when they got the chance. Women, in his view, had weak minds, were deeply unstable in their inclinations. They needed to have constancy inculcated into them. And that meant prescribing what sort of education they should have, or rather lack of education. Actually, women in Napoleon's view didn't need book learning. What they should learn was the domestic arts, that's to say, child rearing, of course, but also sewing, dressmaking, and so on. I quote, again, the advantage of all this is that they are given practice in everything they are likely to be called upon to do, and that their time is normally filled up with sensible and useful occupations. Now, there's some advantage, he thought, in teaching them some mathematics so that they could keep household accounts, but none in teaching them languages, because literature would have disturbed them. And whereas some science might be all right, the danger there is that it might make them think critically about religion. And that would be absolutely fatal. Religion, says Napoleon, is all important for girls. Whatever people may say, it's the mother's surest safeguard and the husband's. What we ask of education is not that girls should think, but that they should believe. And it's well known that Napoleon thought that the mysteries of religion were no more than the mystery of the social order, and that it's the real key to social control. But clearly, he saw religion, or the religion of women, as the very mainspring of that. Religious women, just like his mother, would pass on their religion to their children, although she didn't do a particularly good job in his case. But this, he thought, would ensure the perpetuity of social order and social subordination. But just in case religion's not enough to keep women in their place, there's also the law. Napoleon, remember, declared, however disingenuously, I think, that while Waterloo would eclipse the memory of all his previous victories, his code of laws would make his name live forever. But for women, that code of laws was very bad news indeed. The ideal behind the civil code for women was for them to pass directly from the tutelage of their father to that of their husband. If they didn't marry, and if they had some property to support themselves, well, women could enjoy a certain independence under the code. They got an equal right with male children to a share of the parental property, but of course not until parents died. So that many unmarried women would remain in effect dependent even after reaching the age of majority. But once married, they got no control over their own property. They could do nothing legal without their husband's consent. They couldn't even bear witness in a court of law. Divorce was possible, as it had been since 1792, but on very unequal terms. A woman could seek divorce only on grounds of her husband's adultery under the conjugal roof. But a man could seek divorce for adultery committed anywhere, that is, if he didn't choose instead to imprison his wife. He could seek divorce because the wife had not had children, even because she was too old for children, as with Josephine. Domestic violence against women was almost impossible to prosecute, so was rape. And there's no legal way to establish paternity or paternal responsibility in the cases of illegitimacy. So Napoleon's world, in short, is a man's world, and women are there for the service of men, for their pleasure, for their comfort, for their reproduction. The only positive thing, you might argue, that his regime ever did for women was to try to make some state provision for obstetrics and midwifery to reduce mortality in childbirth. But even that, I think, was severely utilitarian in its inspiration. At a time when the French birth rate was beginning to fall, Napoleon was very anxious that his reserves of men should not diminish, and safer childbirth was obviously one way of promoting that, good servicing of the baby machine. Now, all this was long depicted as a disappointing step backwards for women after the emancipatory promise of the French Revolution. And it's been put into the dossier on the most time-honoured and endlessly rehearsed question about Napoleon, the subject of innumerable exam questions, and to some extent my lecture next week as well, is Napoleon the perpetuator or the destroyer of the work of the French Revolution? The evidence on women is usually thrown in on the negative side, perhaps understandably enough. But what I want to ask in the concluding part of what I got to say is how justified this is, and if it's not justified, then what are the consequences for our understanding of Napoleon's relationship with the revolution? Now, the starting point here is that over the last 25 years or so, maybe a bit longer, the whole question of women and the French Revolution has been a very hot issue among historians. Feminist writers, and most others followed them in this, I think, they've argued that so far from having an emancipatory effect on women, the French Revolution is positively anti-women. And integral to the revolutionary project is a deliberate attempt to force women back into an exclusively domestic role. The argument goes like this. The revolutionaries thought that women in public life are troublemakers. Under the old regime, which was, until the revolution came along, their main source of examples for how public life was conducted, under the old regime, the corruption of the monarchy could largely be attributed to the influence of bad women over weak kings. You've got the notorious mistresses of Louis XV, including Madame de Pompadour, who got France into a disastrous alliance with Austria. And then the trollop Madame du Barry, who helped the king ride roughshod over French laws and liberties at the end of his reign. Now, Louis XVI had no mistresses, but he was married to the feckless, extravagant, and interfering Marie Antoinette, a hated Austrian woman. And if you looked abroad in the 18th century, look no further than Catherine the Great, the Russian despot who murdered her husband to seize the throne and who gratified her innumerable lovers with gifts of thousands of helpless serfs. She did this while corresponding with French philosophers. But that's entirely characteristic as well. The Enlightenment itself was shot through by the influence of scheming and ambitious women, salon hostesses, who enjoyed manipulating influential people. The only philosopher who spurned that world was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who declared that women's place was in the home. Rousseau, in turn, much influenced by ancient models of civic virtue at Sparta or Rome, where men went off to fight and the women stayed behind. Now, all this came together, say the gender historians of the revolution, as part of the revolutionary rejection of the old regime and its corrupt ways. Rousseau's the hero and the prophet for the revolutionaries, and in establishing a new world of civic virtue, they deliberately set out to exclude women from the public sphere. Never mind the women who brought the king to Paris, all those bizarre revolutionary Amazons like Olympe de Gouges, who proclaimed women's rights and strutted about in tricolor sashes and caps of liberty. These are all women out of place, like Dr. Johnson's dogs walking on their hind legs. Even when they achieved something beneficial, it's a pity that it couldn't have been achieved some other way, some more ordered way. And later on, when the revolution fell out of the church, women proved to be the mainstay of counter-revolution, keeping religion going throughout the time when the revolutionaries were trying to stamp it out. So all in all, women had nothing but trouble. And a tremendous quantity of ink has been spilt on what's come to figure as the key moment in the gender history of the revolution, the suppression in October 1793 of the Society of Revolutionary Republican Citizenesses, sounds better in French, a female political club. It's done amid much proclamation that a woman's place is in the home, bringing up babies, ministering to the creature comforts of rugged male patriots. Now, I think this is quite a powerful case when you look at it. What, after all, can we think of that women actually gained from the French Revolution? Not the vote, certainly. Not the right to be elected to anything. Not, in the end, as we've seen, to any public role at all. What it all seems to boil down to, if you're putting profit and loss side by side, is easier divorce. By the law of the 20th of September 1792, divorce was allowed by mutual consent on a wide range of grounds, including simple incompatibility. Either side could institute proceedings in complete equality, and some women feared that this would allow men to dump their wives, just like Napoleon, simply because they'd grown old. But at least that was a thoroughly equal law, compared to which the Napoleonic provisions in the Code of 1804 were a huge step backwards. But note the date of the 1792 law, 20th of September 1792. It's therefore passed on the last day of the Legislative Assembly. That's an assembly dominated by the Girondins. The convention, which met the next day, will be dominated by Jacobins. And it seems to me there were actually two distinct French revolutionary attitudes to women. The Girondins were in fact quite favourable to female equality. Condorcet campaigned for it. And one of the things that held them together politically was the influence of the salon of Madame Roland, the most famous revolutionary woman of all. The most prominent of the revolutionary Amazons, Olympe de Gouges and Théroigne de Méricourt, they were Girondin supporters. Against them were Jacobins, who were clearly scared of woman power, who conciliated the women of Paris only because they felt they had to, but struck down the women's political clubs as soon as they felt they safely could. So it's not the revolution as some sort of monolithic entity that's hostile to women and to their aspirations. It's the Jacobins who took over the revolution in the course of 1793 and drove more liberal and adventurous elements out. It's always seemed to me that the true French revolutionaries are not the Jacobins who gave France terror, but the Girondins who resisted terror and eventually perished by it. And not because, as is usually claimed, they were too moderate, but actually because they were too radical. Their more flexible attitude to women, I think, certainly seems to fit in with that. Now, in 1793, when the differences between Girondins and Jacobins were coming to a head, Napoleon is still a nobody. Although one of the few things we know he said in his years of obscurity was to condemn the mobs which overthrew the monarchy in August 1792, in which women played such a prominent part. But notoriously, Napoleon's first appearance on the national stage came at the end of 1793 when he was famously instrumental in recapturing the naval port of Toulon from British occupation. Now, once that was done, he played his part in shooting French collaborators that the British had left behind. He was, therefore, a terrorist, an instrument of the Jacobin Convention. And he early boosted his career to links with the brother of Robespierre. When Robespierre fell in July 1794, Napoleon is briefly imprisoned as a suspected creature of the fallen tyrant. And when in his first command, he mowed down the Vendémiaire insurgents in September 1795 with Carlyle's famous whiff of grape shot, he was actually acting as the spearhead of a Jacobin reaction against royalists. So, in fact, right up until 1799, Napoleon could plausibly be depicted as a Jacobin. Ruthless, destructive, and it's only his need to find a scapegoat for his seizure of power in 1799 that made him strike anti-Jacobin posers and depict himself as France's saviour from a return to terror. Well, I hope it's clear by now where this is leading. If Jacobinism was the real anti-female strain in the revolution, and if Napoleon was most plausibly identifiable as a Jacobin throughout his early career, then Napoleon's attitude to women should not be seen as in the least surprising. It's a Jacobin one through and through, against all female meddling in public affairs, although very careful to meet the concerns of market women of Paris through strict controls over the price of bread. But determined to ensure that women stayed at home under the complete domination of their menfolk. So Napoleon's policies on women, so far from reversing what the Jacobin Republic had done for or to them, they largely endorsed it. Now, whether that's truly revolutionary or not is a rather different question, especially if you accept my suggestion that the defeated Girondins were in fact more revolutionary than the victorious Jacobins. Either way, Napoleon's divorce legislation represented the final defeat of the Girondin vision of female rights and family life. On the other hand, we have to ask where Napoleon's insistence on women as a vehicle of religious instruction fits in with this, when one source of Jacobin misogyny was the strength which counter-revolution derived from female religiosity. To emphasize the value of female religiosity hardly seems very Jacobin. And yet, even the Jacobins of 1793 and 1794 didn't really blame the women for the so-called superstition or fanaticism which they displayed. They are simply weak and impressionable creatures misled by the wiles of priestcraft. The priests are the problem, not the women, in the Jacobin version of things. And Napoleon thought the same. But with his unerring realism, he saw that the way to deal with that problem is not to fight its source, but to take it over. Do a deal with the priests, and the woman problem takes care of itself. And that, of course, is what happened. By making an agreement with Rome, the famous Concordat of 1801, Napoleon made the Catholic Church in France an ally rather than an enemy, while ensuring at the same time that he and his agents controlled the French clergy completely. Controlling them, you control the women, and you channel their religiosity into upholding the established order rather than obstructing it. But they're still the same weak-brained, credulous creatures that the men of 1793 had found so exasperating. And the essence of Napoleonic social policy is to turn those weaknesses into strengths for the regime, but let the men, including the priests, get on with running a man's world in in the exclusive interests of men.